The finished piece would stretch to more than 30,000 words and be divided into two parts to appear in two consecutive issues of the magazine. It's a marvel of long-form reporting and one of the more beloved entries in McPhee's long bibliography. It couldn't have existed, however, without McPhee's willingness to put everything else on hold and just lie on his back, gazing upward toward the sky, thinking hard about how to create something wonderful. I came across this story of John McPhee's unhurried approach during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, which was, to put it mildly, a complicated time for knowledge workers. As that anxious spring unfolded, a long simmering unease with the demands of productivity among those who toil in offices and at computer screens for a living began to boil over under the strain of pandemic-related disruptions. As someone who often touched on productivity issues in my writing on technology and distraction, I experienced this intensifying backlash directly. Productivity language is an impediment to me, one of my readers explained to me in an email. The pleasure in thinking and doing things well is such a deep-wired human pleasure, and it feels to me diluted when it's linked to productivity. A commenter on my blog added, "The productivity terminology encodes not only getting things done, but doing them at all costs." The specific role of the pandemic as a driver of these sentiments was often evident in this feedback. As one insightful reader elaborated, the fact that productivity equals widgets produced is, if anything, clearer during this pandemic as parents fortunate enough to still have jobs are expected to produce similar amounts of work while caring for and educating kids. This energy surprised me. I love my audience, but fired up is not usually a term I use to describe them. Until now. Something was clearly changing. As I soon discovered, this growing anti-productivity sentiment wasn't confined only to my readers. Between the spring of 2020 and the summer of 2021, a period spanning less than a year and a half, at least 4 major books were published that took direct aim at popular notions of productivity. These included Celeste Headley's Do Nothing, Anne Helen Peterson's Can't Even, Devin Price's Laziness Does Not Exist, and Oliver Burkeman's delightfully sardonic 4,000 Weeks. This exhaustion with work was also reflected in multiple waves of heavily reported social trends that crested one after another during the pandemic. First, there was the so-called Great Resignation. Though this phenomenon encompassed retreats from labor force participation in many different economic sectors, among these many sub-narratives was a clear trend among knowledge workers to downgrade the demands of their careers. The Great Resignation was then followed by the rise of quiet quitting, in which a younger cohort of workers began to aggressively push back on their employers' demands for productivity. We are overworked and overstressed, constantly dissatisfied, and reaching for a bar that keeps rising higher and higher, writes Celeste Headley in the introduction to Do Nothing. A few years earlier, this sentiment might have seemed provocative. By the time the pandemic peaked, however, she was preaching to the choir. As I witnessed this fast-growing discontent, it became clear to me that something important was happening. Knowledge workers were exhausted, burned out from an increasingly relentless busyness. The pandemic didn't introduce this trend so much as push its worst excesses beyond the threshold of tolerability. More than a few knowledge workers, thrust suddenly into remote work, their kids screaming in the next room as they suffered through yet another Zoom meeting, began to wonder, what are we really doing here? I began extensively covering knowledge worker discontent, as well as alternative constructions of professional meaning, on my long-standing newsletter, as well as on a new podcast I launched early in the pandemic. As the anti-productivity movement continued to pick up speed, I also began to cover the topic more frequently in my reporting for The New Yorker, where I'm on the contributor staff, ultimately leading, during the fall of 2021, to my taking on a twice-a-month column called Office Space that was dedicated to this subject. The storylines I uncovered were complicated. People were overwhelmed, but the sources of this increasing exhaustion weren't obvious. Online discussion of these issues offered no shortage of varied and sometimes contradictory theories. Employers were relentlessly increasing the demands on their employees in an attempt to extract more value from their labor. No, it's actually an internalized culture valorizing busyness driven by online productivity influencers that's leading to our exhaustion.